Okay, we've just gone after 6 o'clock, so we might kick things off. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second Conservation Zones Review Information webinar for the Pittwater area. We've been undertaking a significant piece of work to land on how we want to use the conservation zones for our local government area, and tonight we want to take you through that work with a focus on the former Pittwater local government area that's controlled by the Pittwater Local Environmental Plan. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we're all meeting tonight, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people here with us in the meeting tonight. In relation to the agenda for tonight, we will take you through some background information, provide you with an overview of the Conservation Zones Review, outline the draft conservation zones themselves, provide an overview of the technical studies that have informed the application of the conservation zones, outline the next steps, and then we'll have an open question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Just some webinar conventions. So if you look up at the top right-hand side of your screen there, you should be able to see a box, several boxes with some functions in them. If you want to ask a question, you can see the Q&A box there that's circled in red and has a little red dot circling around it. Just type your question into that and we'll have staff available to answer that question. You can type that in throughout the presentation or wait till the question and answer session at the end. We want to focus on the bigger picture stuff tonight. So if you have a specific question and we're not able to answer that in detail tonight, we'll reach out to you in the days following tonight's session and be able to provide you with an answer. We've kept people's cameras off and mute on tonight, just because there's quite a few people in the meeting tonight, and it's easier to manage questions and answers, and you don't get background noise and the like with lots of people with microphones coming on and off. The session will be recorded, so just wanting to let people know that will be recorded, and we'll get underway. In relation to our program of work, so we commenced with back in 2018 with an LEP review and health check. We then prepared our local strategic planning statement called Towards 2040, which was adopted in March 2020. We then prepared a local housing strategy that was adopted in April 2021. We then had a discussion paper for our local environmental plan and development control plan that was put on exhibition in the middle of last year. And all of that work has fed into the work that we have on exhibition now for our conservation zones. We've also got several technical studies that are on exhibition at the moment that have informed the conservation zones work that we've had underway. I'll now I'll just say that then beyond that, we'll review all of the material and all of the submissions that we receive during the exhibition period. We'll analyse that, make any changes that we need to make, and then use that to inform the preparation of our draft local environmental plan and development control plan for the Northern Beaches. There'll then be another round of exhibition around the middle of next year. So we'll report that draft LEP to Council. It will then need to go into the department, and then there will be another round of exhibition around the middle of next year. I'll now hand over to Kim from Meridian Urban, who has worked with us on this project so far, and Kim will take us through the next part of tonight's presentation. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you, Andrew, and good evening, everyone. Before I jump into the approach we undertook for the creation of the draft conservation zones, to start with, we just need to explain what some of the key terms are to give context to the conservation zones review. As Andrew has mentioned, Council is in the process of preparing a single planning framework, which involves preparing a new local environmental plan. A local environmental plan is a legal instrument that establishes land use zones and standards to control development. Across the Northern Beaches, there are 4 existing local environmental plans. The Pittwater Local Environmental Plan, which is the area subject to the webinar tonight, the Warringah Local Environmental Plan, the Warringah 2000 for Deferred Matters Land, and the Manly Local Environmental Plan. As part of preparing a single planning framework, a new local environmental plan will be prepared for the entire Northern Beaches. LEPs are prepared by the relevant council and approved by the state government. What are zones? Zones and development controls provide a framework for the way land can be used. This framework for the zones is standardised and it's set by the state government. Zones set out what land uses are allowed or permitted with consent or permitted without consent, and what uses are prohibited, so what uses are not allowed. The land uses must relate to the objectives of those zones. There are different zones that can be used depending on the intent of that land, such as rural zones, residential zones, commercial zones, industrial zones, recreational zones, waterway zones, and conservation zones. Tonight, we are discussing the conservation zones. What are conservation zones? Conservation zones, or C zones, are used to protect and manage land that has important environmental value. There are 4 conservation zones, which are used where the land has a primary focus on the conservation and/or management of environmental values or natural processes. The C zones provide for the varying levels of environmental protection and management. The C1 zone comprises existing national parks, nature reserves and conservation areas established under the National Parks and Wildlife Act. As such, the C1 zone was not included as part of the conservation zones review. The C2 zone provides that next highest level of protection and is for protecting, conserving and rehabilitating land with very high ecological values. So this can include land such as wetlands and littoral rainforests, and areas of high value remnant vegetation, which is generally found on public land and land that has an environmental protection mechanism on it to protect those conservation values, such as a biobanking agreement or a stewardship agreement. The C3 zone is also for protecting, conserving and rehabilitating land with high environmental values or land that has environmental processes or hazards that require careful management. The C3 zone allows development in limited circumstances, such as low impact development that is compatible with protecting those environmental values or is compatible with the risks associated with the land affected by natural hazards. The C4 zone is also for protecting, conserving environmental values. However, it accommodates low impact residential development. So it is generally used in low density residential areas to protect land with special environmental values and still allow residential development to occur, such as dwelling houses. Why are the conservation zones being reviewed? Across Pittwater, Warringah and Manly, there is a variation in how the conservation zones have been applied in terms of their environmental values, their criteria, the spatial application and the range of land uses that have been permitted. The map on the right shows the differences across the Northern Beaches. So for example, A lot of Pittwater is included in the C4 zone, which is that light brown colour. Warringah, on the other hand, has limited use of C zones. And Manly, you see C zones along the foreshore and adjoining national parks. The C zones review will ensure a greater protection of the environment, and a consistent approach is applied across the entire Northern Beaches, delivering on Council's commitments. It will also align with updated studies, which are also out on public exhibition. What is the purpose of the C Zones review? The purpose of the review was to undertake a review and develop a consistent approach for identifying land across the Northern Beaches with important environmental values, and land that may be subject to hazards that should be protected and managed through a C2, C3 or a C4 zone. As previously said, the C1 zone comprises existing national parks, nature reserves and conservation areas established under the National Parks and Wildlife Act, and as such, it was not included as part of the Conservation Zones review. The approach for undertaking the Conservation Zones review required a robust research-driven process and focus group engagement to understand local issues and experiences and identify those important environmental values and hazards across the Northern Beaches that need to be protected and managed. In terms of developing the conservation zones, Phase 1 involved a review of existing information such as state expectations and policy requirements, other conservation zones reviews undertaken by other councils, including the Northern Council's E-Zone review, which was undertaken by the state government, technical information, including supporting technical studies and mapping prepared by council, and which is also out on public exhibition at the moment, community feedback, which included a series of 5 community focus group sessions which were undertaken during September and October in 2020. And the purpose of those was to identify what environmental values are important for the community across the different places in the Northern Beaches. Phase 2 then involved identifying the environmental criteria that needed protection and natural hazard processes that need careful management, such as bushfire and flooding, as well as the required data to spatially identify those values on the land affected. Phases 3 and 4 involve creating and preparing the proposed draft conservation zones mapping, which is currently out on public exhibition, together with the preparation of a supporting technical review report. We are currently in Phase 5 and publicly exhibiting the draft conservation zones review mapping and report. Council is seeking feedback on the criteria and the methodology that was used to create the draft C zones. Following public exhibition, submissions will be reviewed and any site visits undertaken as needed, and the recommendations for Council finalised as part of Phases 6 and 7. This slide provides a high-level overview of what was said through the previous 5 focus group sessions with a focus on Pittwater. Feedback received noted that consultation with the community is required. There was support for protecting the environment, including prioritising and protecting wildlife corridors. Corridors, tree cover, waterways, bushfire were considered important environmental values in Pittwater. There was support for maintaining the existing C4 zoning in Pittwater and protecting existing C2 zoned land. Comments suggested applying a transition area or buffer to further protect high-value biodiversity areas. Conservation zones were also considered important for water quality. Comments received also noted that the C zones are critical in the coastal communities, noting that the coastal communities are subject to coastal subsidence and flooding. Development should not add to the coastal risk that is already there, and areas with high bushfire risk should also be included as a C zone. The next part of the briefing, we will go through the draft methodology used for creating the draft C zones mapping. We are seeking comments and submissions on the proposed methodology, which has been used to create the conservation zones. This includes the next couple of slides, which shows the criteria used to inform the spatial mapping. The Conservation Zones Review has identified a number of environmental values that are worthy of protection through a conservation zone. This included both high value environmental criteria and medium value environmental criteria. High value environmental criteria identifies land with high ecological values or the greatest biodiversity and number of species that should be conserved and protected. This includes land with bushland reserves and parks, existing C2 zone land, biodiversity core habitat areas, which is generally large expanses of relatively intact native vegetation, or land with high to very high conservation significance, threatened ecological communities and threatened species habitat, wetlands and riparian corridors, selected land in a heritage conservation area with high environmental value, and transitional areas between high conservation value land, so things like national parks, and low residential density land in urban areas. Medium value criteria were also identified and are also an important consideration for identifying land with important environmental values. However, this land may be disturbed or modified, or the land requires careful management. So, for example, biodiversity corridors and urban tree canopy facilitates flora and fauna movement across the landscape and are an important consideration for connecting bushland within urban settings. Escarpments, major ridge lines and sloping land were also, which given their limitations for development over time, has meant that they are generally forested and therefore contribute to that urban ecology in suburban residential settings. Planning for natural hazards is fundamentally about risk to life and property, but it is also about taking steps to limit the future impositions on government functions like disaster management and evacuation, and also on expenditure on recovery and reconstruction. Therefore, it's proposed that as part of the C3 zone, land affected by high-risk natural hazards is considered, where the further intensification of those areas would expose people and property to an intolerable level of risk, and buildings would be vulnerable to failure. It is important to note that when utilising a C3 zone on land affected by high-risk natural hazards, it is about identifying what land uses are compatible given the nature of those risks in terms of risk tolerance. Land uses such as community infrastructure and critical services, vulnerable uses, and residential and accommodation activities are generally considered sensitive or intolerable in locations where there is a high hazard risk. As part of the conservation zones, the hazard criteria constraints identified include land subject to coastal and estuarine hazards, land subject to high risk flooding, land subject to high risk bushfire, and land affected by steeply sloping coastal cliffs, which are susceptible to instability. The next few slides, we will discuss how the environmental hazard criteria and how the environmental criteria will apply for the C2, C3 and C4 zones with a focus on Pittwater. Urban areas are shown in pink and non-urban areas are shown in brown. The C2 zone is proposed to include natural open space and bushland areas which are primarily managed for conservation purposes. It is also proposed to include land with an existing C2 zone which is zoned for environmental protection and where strict controls on development already apply, as well as land that has an existing conservation mechanism requiring its protection for its conservation values, such as a biobanking agreement or a conservation covenant. The map on the right shows that most of the C2 zone across Pittwater includes land currently included in an existing C2 zone. This includes the existing C2 zone that extends along waterways, along the western foreshore areas, as well as across the Pittwater Peninsula and around Narrabeen Lagoon. The C3 zone is proposed to be considered across both urban and non-urban settings. And as I previously said, the map on the right shows urban areas in pink and non-urban areas in a light brown colour. This slide is about the application of the C3 zone in non-urban areas. Non-urban areas have extensive tracts of high-value bushland coupled with a larger minimum lot size, which prevents further lot fragmentation. In non-urban areas, the C3 zone is proposed to apply to land that is identified as having undeveloped bushland, and the site is mapped with one or more of the high environmental criteria. For properties less than 5,000 square metres, a C3 zone is proposed to apply where 50% or more of the site is affected. No split zones are proposed. Split zones are proposed to be considered for properties 5,000 square metres or more, where 30 to 70% of that property is affected by the criteria. If 70% or more of the property is affected, the entire site is proposed as a potential C3 zone. The C3 zone is also proposed to be considered on land where there is a presence of high natural hazard risks, such as bushfire. The map on the right shows that most of the land proposed to be included in a C3 zone in the non-urban areas of Pittwater includes the western foreshore coastal communities, which are currently included in a C3 zone, as well as the Ingleside area, which includes properties that are predominantly covered in bushland, and as a result, some of those properties are identified as having core habitat, and also some of those properties are identified as being affected by bushfire hazard. In the urban areas, the C3 zone is proposed to be used on land affected by high-risk natural hazards, such as flooding and coastal hazard risks. They are proposed as a way to manage development and limit incompatible land uses which are sensitive to high-risk natural hazards or are difficult to evacuate. As previously discussed, the natural hazard criteria considered include mapped coastal and estuarine hazards, high-risk flooding, land affected by high-risk bushfire, and land in close proximity to coastal cliffs which are susceptible to instability. Across Pittwater, urban areas, there is an increase in C3 properties, C3 zoned properties. The map on the right shows that most of the land proposed to be included in a C3 zone in urban areas generally includes properties along the coastline. Properties identified for a proposed C3 zone are largely as a result of the property being affected by coastal and estuarine hazards and or being affected by coastal cliff hazards. With the presence of high environmental values, biodiversity corridors, leafy escarpment lands, major ridge lines and steep slopes, the Northern Beaches has one of the highest urban tree canopy coverages in Greater Sydney. The C4 environmental living zone is proposed for the suburban low-density residential areas that contain high environmental criteria and or 2 or more medium value environmental criteria. Properties with 50% or more of the site affected by high environmental value criteria or 2 or more medium values were identified as potential C4 zoned sites. The map on the right shows that most of the land proposed to be included in a C4 zone is largely as a result of the property being identified with threatened ecological communities, the property being identified as a transition property as it is adjacent to high conservation value land, the property being identified as being included in a selected conservation area with high environmental value, such as along Ruskin Row, or the property being identified with 2 or more medium environmental value criteria, as the property has a combination of biodiversity corridor and urban tree canopy cover, ridge lines and escarpments or steep slopes. It is noted that across the entire LGA, there has been an increase in conservation zones. This slide shows the proposed permitted land uses for the C2, C3 and C4 zones. Dwelling houses are not permitted on land zoned C2 under the existing local environmental plans. However, dwelling houses are permitted on land zones C3. This is not proposed to be changed. The C3 zone is proposed to not permit land uses that may not be compatible with high-risk natural hazards, including childcare facilities, community facilities, educational establishments, respite daycare centres, group homes and secondary dwellings. The C4 and residential R2 zone are similar in that they both allow dwelling houses, group homes, secondary dwellings, as well as low-intensity community activities such as home businesses, childcare facilities and community facilities. The main differences with the C4 zone is the recognition of environmental attributes requiring a careful consideration during the assessment of a development application, and complying development is permitted in the residential R2 zone. However, it is not permitted in the C4 zone. That means that in the C4 zone, a development application would be required. I'll now briefly touch on the technical studies which have informed the conservation zones review and are also out on public exhibition. Council is also seeking feedback and comments on the draft technical studies during this exhibition period. Please note that we will briefly talk through the studies related to Pittwater. However, if you are interested in any of the other studies, they are available on Council's website. The Draft Biodiversity Planning Review is a Northern Beaches-wide technical study, and it has been prepared to better inform future biodiversity planning controls. The study has included a review of previous biodiversity-related studies and mapping related to the 3 former local government areas, including Pittwater. Draft mapping from the studies has been used to inform the conservation zones mapping analysis and includes key wildlife habitats or core habitats, which are typically the larger areas of bushland and are identified in green on the map, and biodiversity or wildlife corridors, which are identified in blue. Threatened ecological communities such as the Pittwater spotted gum forest, and threatened species habitats or areas such as the grey-headed flying fox colonies at Warriewood and Avalon. The Watercourse, Wetlands and Riparian Land Study summarises a series of technical studies undertaken by environmental consulting firm BMT. It sought to review existing planning controls across the 3 former local government areas associated with watercourse and riparian matters. And it also provided recommendations and updated mapping to be incorporated in a unified local environmental plan and development control plan. Recommendations and mapping identified Category 1 and Category 2 riparian corridors, including a 30-metre buffer, and identified wetland areas, including a 100-metre buffer zone. Riparian corridors and wetlands are an important high-value environmental criteria, which has spatially identified the location of these environmental features for the C-zones mapping analysis. The estuarine planning level, or EPL studies, define the estuarine inundation risk, which is also referred to as coastal inundation. During extreme but rare storm events for affected properties under both existing and future sea level rise conditions. The EPL studies have been prepared for North Harbour and Middle Harbour in Sydney Harbour and Cowan Creek at Cottage Point. The studies used the same approach and methodology as the previous Pittwater EPL study, mapping all properties affected by estuarine inundation. Council has a responsibility to manage coastal hazard risks under the Coastal Management Act and the Coastal Management State Environmental Planning Policy. This includes strategic planning, as well as applying planning provisions and development controls to reduce risks to the natural and built environment from current and future coastal hazards. These studies have informed the spatial mapping analysis for the sea zones by identifying properties that are at risk from current coastal inundation. The Geotechnical Review Report is a technical study undertaken by engineering consulting firm Douglas Partners. It sought to review the existing planning controls across the 3 former local government areas associated with geotechnical planning related matters and provide updated mapping and controls to be incorporated in a unified Northern Beaches local environmental plan and development control plan. A detailed table and map is contained that tags all land across the Northern Beaches into one of 7 geotechnical planning classes, depending on the known underlying geology or soil and topographic position, so its slope. The 3 highest risk geotechnical classes have informed the spatial mapping analysis of the draft conservation zones by identifying properties that are at risk from the highest geotechnical classes. I will now hand back over to Andrew.
Thanks very much, Kim. So just to recap, the New South Wales Government requires all councils to review and develop a single planning framework for their local government area. Our proposal is based on comprehensive studies and will help create a sustainable future for the Northern Beaches. We've identified and proposed conservation zones to best fit with the attributes of the land. The proposed change may affect what you can and can't do on your property, but again, we're still at an early stage and want to hear your feedback, and we'll definitely take that on board as we move forward. In terms of the next steps, so we're on exhibition at the moment. That exhibition period is scheduled to be completed on the 30th of October. If you're having trouble making a submission inside that date, then by all means reach out to us and we're happy to talk to you about when you can get your submission in. We'll then review all of the material that comes in, make any changes that we need to make in moving forward, and prepare a community consultation outcomes report. We'll then feed all of that information into the preparation of our draft local environmental plan and development control plan, which we plan on reporting to council in the middle of next year. There will then be another round of public exhibition for the draft LEP and DCP before it is finalised. So we've had some people submit questions prior to the session tonight. So attendees who've submitted questions, I'll just go through those now. The first question is that it appears our environment is less protected and not more protected. How has protection been increased? So zoning is only one of a number of tools that can assist in protecting the environment. We want to ensure that we have a consistent zoning regime, and that's why we've gone out with our conservation zones review, but we're also at the same time preparing our LEP and DCP. So the additional controls that we'll be looking at would be biodiversity controls that we can include in the LEP and DCP. There's also landscape open space, deep soil requirements that we're looking to include. We can also control building bulk and scale via floor space ratios and excavation controls that not all of the LEPs have. So it's noted that Pittwater LEP doesn't have floor space ratio control or indeed excavation controls in the LEP. So we're looking to try and introduce that potentially into the Northern Beaches LEP, and that will be on exhibition next year. There's also an increase in the use of the C3 zone throughout the Pittwater area, and there's also been an increase in the proposed use of the conservation zones, particularly in areas like Ingleside. So that's opportunities to increase those layers of protection there. Does that ultimately mean that we're going to lose more trees in Pittwater? How else are trees going to be protected? So again, there's a number of different controls that can apply to the protection of trees. Mapping of core habitats, biodiversity corridors and areas with high urban tree canopy cover is intended in Council's future planning controls in our LEP and DCP. As I touched on, the conservation zones are looking to extend into areas like the Bayview Escarpment and Ingleside that are currently zoned. Parts of those are zoned residential, parts of those are zoned rural, but have extensive natural values. So we're looking at areas where there's consistent intact bushland up there being covered by the conservation zones. Why are some properties classed differently to their surrounds? So the answer to that is, look, we've obviously done a really detailed analysis and mapping, and where properties are proposed to be zoned either C3 or C4, those properties have met either hazard or environmental criteria. Where properties are proposed to be zoned residential or rural, then they haven't met the thresholds for the criteria to be a C3 or a C4 zone. There's information on how we've arrived at those decisions on our website, and you can even look on a property by property basis to see which particular affectations have been identified on those properties. So if people have specific questions about specific properties, then by all means reach out to us and we can provide you with the information on those particular properties. We're also interested in your feedback on the methodology that we've used and how it's been applied. So, very open to people's commentary in relation to that. Can we change the weighting of medium environmental value criteria for C4 to be set to high environmental value criteria? Again, we're in an exhibition phase, and so welcome any and all feedback in relation to those criteria that have been identified and indeed their weighting and how they're used. Currently, my neighbour has been allowed to subdivide. Will I still be able to subdivide my property, which is the same size? So we're not proposing to, as part of the conservation zones work, to change any minimum lot sizes. That's dealt with by the minimum lot size map in the LEPs, and we're not proposing to change that as part of this work. What is a residential zone and what will be permitted? So the review identifies some areas as a generic residential zone for sites that were previously a conservation zone. We've provided a range of uses that we think will be permitted, but we haven't landed on the final outcome for all of those. We're still working through that. We wanted to focus on the conservation zones for the purposes of this exhibition. It's likely that particularly for the Pittwater area, that those residential zones will be very similar to the R2 low density residential zone that people may be familiar with in the current Pittwater LEP. So that's likely, what the default residential zone would be in that area. But again, welcome any feedback and any suggestions that people have in relation to that. Will the residential zone mean more density? Look, by changing from a conservation zone to a residential zone, we're certainly not intending to increase density in those areas. We do know that the state policies relate differently to the C4 and some residential zones. So there are some technical issues there that we're alive to those issues, and we're continuing to have conversations with the Department of Planning in relation to those issues. How is the new C4 zone different to the current C4 zone? So it won't be substantially different to the existing C4 zone in the Pittwater area, and you can compare those by again going to our website, clicking on a property that's currently C4 and proposed to be C4, and you can see the permissibilities there. Permissibility of swimming pools, fences, hobby beekeeping and road stalls in C3. So look, swimming pools, fences, will be ancillary to the existing use of the dwelling, so that'd be permissible. Similarly, if it's hobby beekeeping, then that's ancillary again to the use of the property. If it's if you're not giving it or selling some sort of large scale beekeeping operation that would tip it over into more of an agricultural type use, then that's fine. Roadside stalls, I think, are proposed to be prohibited in the C3 zone under the current or under the proposed zoning framework, but we'd welcome any feedback people have in relation to that. Why are ridgelines in areas of high geotechnical report preparation being zoned residential? So we've looked at the ridgelines and applied a medium environmental value to those in our methodology. Again, happy to hear feedback in relation to that. In relation to the geotechnical areas, again, there's geotechnical planning classes that were identified with a medium environmental value, and that is outlined in the website and how that's used. Happy to talk you through that following tonight's meeting. So that was the formal questions that have been submitted. I can see there's been some questions and answers submitted in the Q&A section that people are responding to. I can see we've got some questions there. Happy to go through those now. So we've got a question from John saying that he's not happy with the proposal to zone some land C3, so rural land C3. And there's been an answer there from Susie. I guess just in relation to that, I would say that, look, we hear what you're saying. We understand that you've got concerns with that and with the process. I guess changing zones and permissible land uses is a process facilitated by the New South Wales planning system, and it's not an uncommon occurrence over time. The zoning framework doesn't remain static forever, and indeed, it's the government asking us to make changes to our current planning regime because we have 4 LEPs and we need to move to a position where we've got 1 LEP. In order to do that, we need to make decisions in relation to zoning and permissible land uses as part of that process. What's important is that we provide opportunities for people to understand why we're doing what we're doing. It's one of the reasons we've provided so much information on our website, so we're as open book as possible, and provide people with the opportunity to look at everything that we're looking at as we're making our decisions. You can see our methodology that's proposed, and we welcome comments and observations in relation to what's proposed. Again, this is a non-statutory process, so we've deliberately gone out to the community without the weight of a statutory exhibition, so we can engage with people and hear what they've got to say about that. The next question there I can see from Michael regarding records of the phase 1 review consultations, and it looks like there's been a link provided to that information. Next question from Michael: change of C zones from C4 to C3 in low density areas along waterways is unnecessary and applies a zone C3, which is more appropriate in non-urban areas. Susie looks like she's provided a response to that, identifying that in the review, the C3 zone is proposed where there are special ecological, scientific, cultural or aesthetic attributes or environmental hazards / processes, and that is why that C3 zone is proposed. Again, picking up that dwelling houses are permitted in that zone, but other uses, more sensitive uses, are proposed to be prohibited in that zone. And again, calling out that this is a draft that's on exhibition and welcome feedback. A question there from Michael regarding C3, C4 and concerns around activities such as tree removal. So look, I guess tree removal is considered on its merits. When an application comes in, our tree officers go out and look at the reason that the tree needs to be removed. If it's in bad health or is hazardous, then they'll support that removal. There's also trees that need to be removed from time to time as part of the DA process, and that's also considered on its merits there. Question again regarding coastal and estuarine hazards along the waterways of Pittwater, technical studies, and then Susie's saying that the hazards are based on the existing technical studies that are listed there. And in the controls, you can see these maps and studies on our website, and then as above, yes, welcome feedback on that. Question there from John: C3 zone, referencing the planning circular, quoting there, and then a response saying there's a different part of the planning circular that says where land is zoned for special ecological, scientific, cultural or aesthetic attributes or environmental hazards, processes that require careful consideration, management, and for uses compatible with those values. So there's a reference in that quite old now planning circular. Question here: where do we find more detailed information on the height of homes one can build? Has it changed recently? And then the answer is, look, we're not proposing any changes as part of this review. There's existing LEPs in place that deal with height, and they can be viewed again on our website. Question from John: I have seen that. Oh, okay, this is back to the practice note, but my comment above will be from page 2, thinking that it trumps that. I guess that will be the argument going forward. Yeah, look, there's understand that position and that reference. I guess we'll have to continue the conversation with the Department of Planning. We know they're doing doing some work in that space, particularly having regard for the outcomes of the flood inquiries that was handed down relatively recently from the floods up in Lismore and the planning for bushfire protection from 2019 and the bushfire inquiry and how to deal with those hazards from a strategic planning point of view. Still got a few minutes to go, so if people have any more questions or comments, happy to see those in the chat. Or if you're not comfortable putting your question in the chat, or you're wanting to reach out to us, then there's some details up on the screen there now. So that's our email address. So by all means, if you think of a question after the meeting's finished that you wished you'd asked, then send us through an email or give us a call on that number there, or have a look on our website there, or even come in and sit down and meet with us. We're happy to talk to you face to face as well. Interested to hear what people have to say. A question there from Jim: why is the definition of residential lagging so far behind? It's critical for the consideration of this review in areas such as Bilgola Plateau. Yeah, look, Jim, I guess what we're saying is we wanted to focus on the conservation zones as part of this review, and we're still doing work in that space, in that sort of landing the residential zones. As I've outlined earlier, the proposal is that those residential zones would look, very similar to the existing R2 residential zone in the Pittwater area. We know that there's a lot of material that's included in the exhibition package, and some people wanted to see the residential zone, some people wanted to see the rural zone, other people would want to see commercial and industrial zones, and you end up almost having a full-blown LEP exhibition. So we wanted to keep the focus on the conservation zones. We understand that people do want to see more material, and that will be included in the exhibition that does occur next year. But as I said, we're not proposing to increase densities in that residential area. It would continue to look similar to the R2 low density residential zone in the Pittwater LEP now, which is in and of itself quite similar to the C4 zone. There's only some minor differences there. Happy to keep holding on here if people are wanting to put any more questions into the chat or into the Q&A, pardon me. We've got a few minutes left. Keep holding on here for a couple of minutes just to give people every opportunity to ask a question. It doesn't look like there's anything else coming through. So we might wrap things up there. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending tonight. Really appreciate you giving up your time to come and hear our presentation. If you've got any more questions or issues or comments that you would like answered, then by all means, please reach out to us. Very happy to hear from you and talk to you as we continue through the process. We're still obviously very much in a draft phase. So welcome submissions and welcome comments, and looking forward to hearing from you and continuing the process to prepare One Northern Beaches local environmental plan and development control plan. Okay, might finish now. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.